Thank you very much. It's great to be among such a distinguished set of panelists, and I can only hope to lose a name and have a shortening of my other name time later in my career to match Naki. I'm presenting today on behalf of both myself and Shanali Pachari, who is one of the convening lead authors for this chapter, and of course all the other authors who participated in the chapter. And I would also like to take just a quick moment to mention Abiku Bruhaman, who was the other convening lead author, who passed away, unfortunately, quite suddenly not long ago, and who was a real driving force behind this chapter and is sorely missed. So I'm not going to dwell on this map because you've seen it, I think, a few times. But basically, we have this problem of 40% or more, a little bit more of the globe lacking access to clean cooking, and a little over 20% of the globe lacking access to any form of electrification. And my goal today is to talk a little bit about what the implications of that are, and then talk about what it means to actually provide access and how we get there. So the first thing we should also talk about is what do we mean by access. Two things have been talked about today. One is who has access, i.e. a physical connection to some form of electricity or some access to modern cooking fuels. And we've also talked about affordability, but access is a little bit more than that. So there is that physical access, availability, but there's also the economic one we've talked about, affordability of a connection and equipment, affordability of the fuel or energy type. We should talk also about illegal access. It's a really important part of the story. Electricity thefts and unaccounted for transmission and distribution losses, what we often call commercial and technical losses, euphemistically. But in fact, electricity theft is a major way that not an insignificant number of people in the world get access to electricity, and we should be aware of that. But we also need to talk about quality and reliability of access, right? We need to talk about uninterrupted access and regular and easy supply to the degree it's necessary to meet the service demands of the population we're talking about. So do we necessarily need immediately 24/7 high quality, 4/9 reliability access in all rural parts of the world? Maybe not, right? But we do need to have access to the level that is going to provide them with a regular and secure supply of energy in a way that they can anticipate. And of course, quantity of access, right? It's not just do you have access, it's do you have access to enough energy to meet those service demands that you have. So why do we care about all of this? Well, we think that electricity is central to all aspects of well-being and development. That's why many of us are here. Right? We have private benefits, illumination, communication, entertainment, thermal comfort, and we have convenience appliances. We, of course, also have income generation, mechanization of the farm and industry, home and micro enterprises, which are an important part of the economy in many parts of the world, and commercial activity. And then, of course, those public and community services like lighting, healthcare, vaccine refrigeration, for example, education, food storage. There's a great picture I saw a few years ago on the education front of a bunch of students, and I believe they were in Ghana, but don't quote me on that, who had gone, in the country that they were in, the final exam out of high school is the critical one. That determines everything about your educational future. And so these students were cramming for the exam. Well, where did they go to cram for the exam? They went to the airport parking lot. Why? They had lights, right? They couldn't do it at home. So they went to the airport parking lot to do it, right? There we go. We also talk about solid fuels a lot. I want to talk a little bit about the negative consequences of solid fuels. By the way, I don't think anybody yet has shown a picture of what we're talking about. So here's a picture of what we're talking about, right? Somebody in their home, at the hearth, putting literally sticks of wood into an open fire and cooking with it. So, social costs. Roughly 4 million premature deaths a year from household air pollution. Kirk has talked about this. And somebody talked about time earlier today. Between 1 to 5 billion women hours lost annually in collection. And a big question, of course, is how do you value that time? It's both a technical question from an economics perspective, but also one in terms of how you convert that lost time into something that's actually able to translate into money to buy the energy technology that would allow them to save that time. It's actually a complicated problem when we think about a benefit-cost analysis perspective of this problem. And of course, impacts on livelihood, right? Limited productive hours during the day because you don't have access to light, limited work and business opportunities. And then there's the environmental consequences, right? Local forest, land, soil degradation, CO2 emissions if biomass is unsustainably harvested, emissions of non-CO2 greenhouse gases and aerosols with higher global warming potential, and in particular, the growing evidence of sort of the strong climate impacts of black carbon or soot. So the big question then is universal modern energy access achievable by 2030? And here I'm going to take from not just the chapter that we produced, which was chapter 19, but chapter 17, the pathways chapter. You've seen some before. But before we get there, let's see where we've been. Right? Historical electrification trends show us that the United States took a number of decades to, in fact, electrify its entire population, with some slowdowns in that process. On the other hand, Egypt, China, Brazil electrified quite a large portion of the population relatively rapidly in comparison to the United States, while other places are lagging behind. India, for example, South Africa, as one of the more developed economies, or the most developed economy in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at sub-Saharan African countries, the picture is not very pretty. Apologies, this way. Okay. So if we look at trends in electricity access for those regions with least access, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and China, the blue bar is the total population increase from 1970 to 1990. The next bar is the incremental population electrified during that time period, the total population increase from 1990 to 2008, and the incremental population electrified in 1990 to 2008. So we have two different time periods, 1970, 1990, 1990 to 2008. We see there that China electrifies at a pace far outstripping population growth, and it was able to, in fact, electrify virtually its entire population, whereas some places like sub-Saharan Africa, population growth continues to outpace electrification rates. So the pace of electrification across time and regions has been very uneven. While China electrified its entire population over a few decades, Thailand and South Africa have collected over 0.4 million new customers annually over a period of about 5 years. But in sub-Saharan Africa, we have this real problem of population growth outpacing new connections. In terms of modern energy for cooking, again, looking at sub-Saharan Africa, China, Indonesia, India, the rest of developing Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the number of people dependent on biomass alone has declined slightly between 2000 and 2009, largely due to reduced dependence in China, but we have this large reliance in China on coal and on charcoal in sub-Saharan Africa, and so we still have these 3 billion people dependent on solid fuels. And as Kirk has pointed out, I think very, very well earlier, we can talk about relative proportions and everything else, but fact of the matter is solid fuels have remained essentially unchanged over the last decades in many developing countries. So here's the bottom line. Without new and dedicated policies, access goals by 2030 are unachievable. If we look at the cooking fuel, the population in billions relying on solid fuels in both rural and urban areas in 2005 and in 2030 with no new policies, we continue to see that we have a large number of people relying on solid fuels, particularly in the rural areas, but the urban population relying on solid fuels also increases, very importantly. And in sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about 92% of the population in the rural areas and 85% of the population in the urban centers. If we kind of flip it around and look at rural electrified populations, we see that obviously from 2005 to 2030, with no new policies, we do have an increase in the number of people who are electrified, but we still have only 31% electrification in sub-Saharan Africa. That's, let's see if I can find this. pointer, this bar down here, right? With universal access, we reach levels of 95% electrification. So let me talk a little bit about modern cooking access and policies for that. So as I said, in the base year 2005, if we look at just the 3 regions of Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and sort of Asia-Pacific region minus China, we're looking at a little over 2 billion people reliant on solid fuels, and with no new policies, an additional 200 million people using solid fuels by 2030. If we look at subsidies of essentially a 50% fuel subsidy on say LPG, and by 2030, we can reduce dependence by about 1/3, right, with subsidies alone. Of course, you still have to buy a stove, so we can look at microfinance, at a 15% interest microfinance scheme for 2030. If you do just that, it's not very effective because the fuel is still not very affordable. So fuel subsidies coupled with grants or microfinance schemes that make cheap credit available for the purchase of new stoves are the most effective. And if you were to do that, you essentially will reduce the population relying on solid fuels to a little less than 500 million, mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa. Right? That's essentially, you eliminate the problem in South Asia and Asia Pacific, but the problem in Sub-Saharan Africa remains. What are the energy demand implications of a universal access policy of this nature? What we see in 2005 is that most household final energy is biomass. That's the green part of the bar. Under no new policies, energy demand goes up because obviously the population is increasing. We have more people using biomass, extra 200 million people using biomass. So the biomass goes up, as does more people using LPG, more people using electricity, more people using kerosene. If we do, I'm going to focus on the last one, if we look at the 50% subsidy plus microfinance with universal electrification at a relatively 400 kilowatt hours per year type of numbers, so it's not all that much energy, but it's some. What we find is actually energy demand goes down. Why? Because the biomass energy combustion is so inefficient. So eliminating biomass energy combustion actually reduces overall energy demand because you're replacing it with much more efficient combustion of LPG and much more efficient electricity, of course. So, with access policies, total household final energy demand is actually lower, even though demand increases for electricity and modern cooking fuels like LPG. Should we be worried about greenhouse gas emissions from this? Not really. In fact, the net impacts on emissions are negligible. We have the 3 regions, South Asia, Pacific Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. The first bar is 2005. The kind of orangey bar is 2030 with no new policies. That is, we have all these extra people still using biomass, et cetera, no people not necessarily getting electrified. And if we look at the blue bar, then with universal access, nothing changes, right? Because we are replacing it with much more efficient energy systems. So that sounds great, but of course, how do we get there? Right? I magically waved my wand and gave you, 50% fuel subsidies and 15% microfinance schemes around the world, and that sounds all wonderful. But what will it actually take to achieve universal access by 2030? It's actually a really complicated problem, and Arnulf made a plea to people, PhD students in the room, to take on some interesting urban energy questions. I'll make a plea, especially to those of you from economics, for example, to take on some very interesting energy access problems, because I think that this is actually an area where energy economists could play a very interesting and exciting role, but is actually relatively largely ignored within the mainstream economics literature and field, right? Energy economists tend to think about other things.
Except for economists have their...
What will it take? It will take about $36 to $41 billion a year till 2030. That sounds like a decent chunk of change. But it's, it's only 5% of global annual energy sector investments, and that's actually less than 8% of current fossil fuel subsidies globally. So, yes, a decent chunk of change, hard to mobilize, unfortunately, that kind of money. But in the grand scheme of things, it's actually not a lot, right? It's a solvable problem, if money was the only problem, right? It's a little bit more complicated when you try to get on the ground and actually do something about it, right? So we need detailed local assessments of existing demands, affordability, options for expanding access. What are the business models that people are going to use, right? We're not talking about just grid electrification, though in the GEA, it was primarily grid electrification was what was modeled, but in fact we know that for large portions of the population, grid electrification is certainly not going to be the first way they get electricity access. In fact, the government of India has written off about 20,000 villages entirely from getting grid access anytime in the foreseeable future, right? So, where are those 20,000 villages going to get their energy access from? It's clearly not the grid. So, if we're doing something that's off-grid, what's the business model, right? Is it a cooperative? Is it a local entrepreneur? Is it an NGO? Is it some public-private partnership that's doing this? If we're talking about cook stoves, are we going to harness the market for doing this? Is it going to be private sector is going to try go in and sell cook stoves and sell fuel? What's the role of the public sector? We have these different types of populations, some of whom might be able to afford clean cooking fuel, some of them who might not. How do we create policies that allow us to target those different sectors in the best way possible? The private sector is going to play a role, clearly. But we do need focused and sustained government commitment and targeted and responsive policies, right? I'm not a big fan of subsidies. I know a lot of people in the room are not a big fan of subsidies, generally speaking, right? In this case, targeted price support, i.e. subsidies, on modern fuels are almost definitely needed. Not almost definitely, are definitely needed, right? The question is how you do it, right? How do you create smart, targeted subsidies to avoid leakage, to avoid persistence of subsidies beyond the time that they're needed, to make sure that the right people get the amount of subsidy that they deserve, right? And we also need to deal with the upfront cost. We're talking about poor populations that don't have cash on hand to go buy a new stove, don't have cash on hand to pay for an electricity connection, right? And so we need to have flexible and adequate institutional arrangements with local involvement, obviously, and enhanced capacity building, right? The capacity is just simply not there on the institutional front, on the technical front, to deal with this problem. And like I said, I mentioned business models before. We need new business models and mechanisms to incentivize the private sector involvement, including through cost recovery. And I'm done.
Wow.
Okay, my 0-minute mark.